April 18, 1942. The deck of the USS Hornet was slick with seawater, shuddering beneath a burden it was never designed to carry. 16 Army B-25 bombers crouched on the carrier's deck like misplaced giants, their wings stretching over startled sailors who stared in stunned silence. This was not how war was supposed to work. The air tasted of salt and steel. Storm clouds bruised the horizon, and every man watching understood he was witnessing something that bent the rules of probability. Army bombers on a Navy ship, an impossible union born not of doctrine, but desperation. By every measure of logic, this raid should never have existed. Only months earlier, Pearl Harbor had burned. America had been struck, humiliated, left bleeding in the Pacific. While the nation struggled to its feet, the Japanese Empire surged outward like a rising tide, seizing the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Across the United States, there was a hunger for something, anything that could restore belief. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that hunger. He knew America did not yet have the power to crush Japan, but it needed to prove it still had the courage to strike back. He wanted fear to visit Japanese soil, not for destruction but for shock, for symbolism, for resolve. And so the task fell to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a man who treated limits as suggestions. Record-breaking pilot, relentless problem solver. When asked to attempt the unthinkable, launch medium bombers from a carrier deck and strike the Japanese homeland, he did not hesitate. The plan was fragile, improvised, held together by engineering brilliance and sheer audacity. Bombers were stripped of armor. Defensive guns were replaced with broomsticks painted black to bluff enemy fighters. Fuel tanks were forced into every available space. Pilots trained on impossibly short runways, learning to coax lumbering aircraft into the air with only a few hundred feet to spare. They were told the truth. This was likely a one-way mission. China was the destination if they survived. No one spoke openly about death, but it hovered at the edge of every conversation. Doolittle walked among the crews with a calm smile, steady hands on shoulders, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew the odds. At dawn on April 18th, those odds worsened. Japanese picket boats spotted the American task force hundreds of miles earlier than planned. Radio warnings sped toward Tokyo. The choice vanished in an instant. The bombers had to launch now. It meant flying more than 600 miles farther than planned over open ocean, with fuel already stretched to the breaking point. When the order reached Doolittle, he didn't blink. "Well," he said quietly, "we'll go in anyway." Engines roared to life. Propellers carved the mist. The carrier deck heaved beneath rolling wheels. Sailors pressed flat against the steel as one by one, the B-25s lunged forward, tails skimming waves before clawing into the sky. Hardened sailors cheered. Some wept. They were watching a miracle balanced on catastrophe. Hours later, that miracle reached Japan. American bombers appeared over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, dropping incendiaries and demolition charges on oil tanks, factories, and military targets. The physical damage was limited. The psychological impact was not. For the first time, Japanese civilians looked skyward and saw American aircraft where no American aircraft should be. The myth of invulnerability shattered. Sirens wailed in disbelief. Smoke rose over the capital. The empire had not been wounded in the body, but in the heart. For the raiders, triumph evaporated quickly. Fuel gauges sagged. Storm clouds thickened. Night closed in as they crossed the coast of China. Some crews crash-landed. Others bailed out into darkness. Farmers discovered parachutes tangled in trees. Pilots lay bruised and bleeding in fields. Some were rescued by Chinese villagers who risked execution to hide them. Others were captured by Japanese patrols, shown no mercy. Doolittle himself parachuted into a rice paddy, convinced the mission had failed. He did not yet know that back home, American morale had soared to heights unseen since April 18, 1942. The USS Hornet's deck glistened with sea spray, trembling beneath the improbable burden of aircraft never intended for such a placement. 16 B-25 bombers, resembling massive creatures confined to a small space, sat poised on the carrier. Their extensive wingspan extended above the sailors, who regarded the scene with a blend of wonder and skepticism. The atmosphere was brine-laced and crisp. A storm-darkened horizon loomed. Observing men recognized this event as defying statistical likelihood. Army bombers aboard a Navy vessel, an unnatural union forged in dire necessity. This was, by all accounts, an assault that defied feasibility. Only months prior, Pearl Harbor had been devastated by fire, leaving the United States reeling, yet determined to recover. The Japanese Empire expanded across the Pacific like an unstoppable surge, its forces pushing into the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Americans desperately sought a morale boost, a symbolic shift in momentum. President Franklin Roosevelt grasped this need profoundly. His aim was to instill fear within Japan's homeland, thereby signaling to the global community America's capacity not just to withstand an attack, but to retaliate with ingenuity and boldness. This mission fell to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, celebrated for his aerial record-breaking feats and his relentless spirit that often disregarded conventional wisdom. He received the extraordinary assignment to launch medium bombers from an aircraft carrier to strike Japan. He agreed instantly, despite the undertaking being largely founded on optimism rather than solid assurances. Despite the haste, preparations were painstakingly detailed. Aircraft were lightened by removing superfluous weight and armor plating. Defensive armaments were substituted with black-painted broomsticks to mislead adversaries, and additional fuel bladders filled every available space. Pilots practiced launching the heavy aircraft from exceptionally short runways, mastering the skill of airborne liftoff within just a few hundred feet. Every participant understood the mission was a one-way trip. Although China was designated as their refuge, few held hope for everyone's survival. Death remained an unspoken, persistent presence in their discussions. Doolittle maintained a composed demeanor, offering reassuring touches to his men, yet his gaze revealed the immense risks involved. This undertaking was an enormous gamble. On April 18th, the stakes abruptly rose when Japanese scout boats detected the task force hundreds of miles away from its planned launch point. Urgent radio signals reached Tokyo, compelling Admiral William Halsey to act. The bombers needed to deploy immediately, significantly ahead of schedule. This necessitated an extended flight of over 600 miles across the open sea, with fuel supplies already critically low. Doolittle's response was resolute. "We'll proceed regardless," he stated. His teams boarded their planes. Engines ignited with a roar, propellers sliced through the morning fog. The carrier deck pulsed beneath the wheels. Sailors braced themselves, hunkering down against the engine blast. One by one, the B-25s ascended, their tail sections momentarily touching the waves before gaining altitude into the wind. The extraordinary sight astonished even seasoned seamen. Cries of encouragement and tears mingled as men witnessed what they believed was a miraculous feat, precariously close to disaster. Within hours, this extraordinary event reached Japanese territory. The aircraft emerged over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, unleashing incendiary and explosive devices upon fuel depots, manufacturing plants, and military installations. While physical damage was limited, the symbolic impact was immense. Previously unseen, American aircraft now filled the Japanese skies, shattering the nation's perceived invulnerability with a wave of terror among civilians. Plumes of smoke ascended over the capital as air raid alarms sounded in astonishment. Journalists struggled to account for the inexplicable, while military commanders reacted with indignant rage. The empire sustained a psychological rather than purely physical blow. The raiders' initial euphoria quickly gave way to the dread of their return journey. As they continued, fuel levels dropped ominously, and clouds grew denser. Darkness enveloped them as they approached the Chinese coast, with mountains silently appearing in the night. Some crews performed forced landings in fields. Others parachuted onto chilly, exposed hills. Locals discovered parachutes caught in trees and found injured, semi-conscious pilots on the ground. A small number received sanctuary from Chinese resistance groups who risked their lives protecting the Americans from Japanese forces. Many, however, were less fortunate, captured by merciless soldiers. Doolittle, after parachuting into a rice paddy, believed the operation had failed. He would later discover his audacious attack had significantly boosted American morale. Yet, at that isolated moment in the mud, he only felt the heavy burden of failure. In Washington, the public reacted with intense excitement to the raid's announcement. Newspapers blared that Tokyo had been attacked, offering Americans a tangible symbol of hope. A grinning Roosevelt jokingly informed journalists the planes originated from the fictional Shangri-La, deliberately concealing the Navy's involvement. Youngsters in rural areas pretended to pilot paper bombers, their imaginations ignited by the audacious men who had assailed the adversary's capital. Japan, conversely, received a message of fury and disgrace from the attack. Military commanders were incensed that such a slight could occur, and their vengeance targeted both the American airmen and the Chinese communities that had aided them. Subsequent massacres in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces saw whole settlements obliterated as retaliation. The raid's lasting impact was recorded in both newsprint and bloodshed. The airmen met various fates. Most eluded capture and eventually returned to American forces. However, 8 were apprehended by the Japanese, subjected to imprisonment, shackled, beaten, and forced into a trial as alleged war criminals for bombing civilians. This accusation carried profound irony, considering Japan's prior destruction of Shanghai and Nanking. For these 8, the mission that commenced with a roar concluded in silence, their destiny obscured by prison confines. Their complete narrative would remain unknown to the world for a considerable time. Therefore, America's inaugural aerial retaliation concluded with paradoxes as cutting as fragments of explosives. An operation logically destined for failure nonetheless instilled fear in the enemy. A bold risk boosted domestic morale but extracted a brutal cost in Asia. Amidst the celebration of bravery, 8 young men were incarcerated, their lives subject to the caprice of an enraged empire. The raid demonstrated America's capability to attack Japan, but it also posed a weighty, lingering question. How would the U.S. react to its servicemen being branded criminals, not combatants? The eventual response would involve far more than 16 bombers. It would unleash an entire fleet. Mildew coated the prison walls, and the atmosphere was heavy with the stench of spoiled rice. 8 young American men were confined to closet-sized cells, their uniforms ripped, their hands chafed raw by coarse ropes. They were the remaining participants of the improbable mission, individuals who had traversed the Pacific in aircraft never designed for such a journey, now diminished figures behind bamboo partitions. In Washington, their names Hallmark, Faro, Spatz, Meter, Nielsen, Height, Barr, and Duchaser were uttered in hushed, worried tones during intelligence updates. However, in occupied China, they were mere prizes, tangible evidence that Japan's dishonor could be repaid through the destruction of prisoners, not through military victories. Their Japanese captors subjected them to a calculated, performative brutality. Unprovoked beatings were common. Water was a precious commodity, sparingly distributed, and even minor acts of resistance resulted in physical abuse or rifle blows. Every man held onto fragments of his past. A mother's visage, a beloved's final correspondence, the distant hum of an aircraft engine. Dean Hallmark, even while shackled, sought to encourage his fellow prisoners by softly humming hymns despite his injured lip. Bill Faro, agile and energetic, broke the quiet by reminiscing about home, baseball fields, Coca-Cola, things that now felt more imagined than recalled. Harold Spatz, reserved and devout, prayed silently with bowed head. Robert Meter, weakened by illness and lack of sustenance, alternated between awareness and confusion, his vitality diminishing daily. They had undertaken their flight with boldness. Now, their bravery was defined by their ability to withstand starvation and degradation. When the trial finally occurred, it amounted to little more than a theatrical presentation for an enraged empire. Japanese functionaries, impeccably uniformed, articulated accusations crisply. The Americans faced charges of civilian bombings and warfare violating humanitarian principles. The hypocrisy was overwhelming. Japan, having shelled Shanghai, burned Nanking, and bombed Manila, now positioned itself as the dispenser of justice. The Americans were afforded no genuine defense nor legal representation. Their testimonies were curtailed, their appeals silenced by the gavel of retribution. For the accused, the judgment was palpable even before utterance. The sentence, a heavy finality, condemned 3 to execution while the remainder received indefinite imprisonment. Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz, names destined for historical recognition, were then merely 3 shaking individuals escorted away by guards. They requested writing materials, which were reluctantly provided, perhaps because the Japanese wished for the drama of their last messages. Months afterward, in smuggled correspondence, the condemned exhibited remarkable composure. Faro assured his mother of his readiness to face God. Hallmark exhorted his family to remain strong and recall him as he once was. Spatz expressed sadness at his premature departure but found serenity through his convictions. Every word composed under the threat of a rifle barrel served as both a goodbye and an act of resistance. The trio was led to an open area near Shanghai on October 14, 1942. There, blindfolded and tied to stakes, they were executed by a firing squad. Rifle shots reverberated through the woods, swiftly followed by a profound stillness. Their remains were quickly interred, the event concealed. For months, their American families maintained hope, unaware their sons lay buried abroad. Japan intended this act as a deterrent, a clear message to the U.S. that additional assaults would incur heavier casualties. In reality, they had ignited an uncontrollable chain of events. The remaining men suffered in confinement for years. Robert Meader's health deteriorated, consumed by illness until his death in December 1943, leaving only 7 surviving raiders. Jacob Duchaser, a spirited young bombardier, initially grew resentful but eventually discovered comfort in the same faith he had previously scorned. Chase Nielsen and the others withstood physical abuse, arduous marches, and interrogations aimed at shattering both their psychological and physical resilience. They subsisted on meager rice portions, their eyes sunken, ribs visibly protruding. Every day was a gamble that the next might not dawn. Yet they persevered, making survival its own triumph. In America, news of the executions slowly surfaced via intercepted communications and diplomatic channels. Authorities initially withheld information, concerned that revealing the details would exacerbate sorrow and outrage, while countless American soldiers remained engaged in the Pacific conflict. However, once the full story came to light post-war, it struck families with the impact of a fresh bereavement. Mothers were informed by letter that their sons had been summarily executed as criminals. Fiancés, still wearing engagement rings on necklaces, grieved in quiet despair. The raid, which initially offered national hope, also etched deep sorrow into numerous homes, inflicting invisible wounds on the home front as profound as any battlefield scar. Despite the anguish, the executions only solidified determination. In Washington, the demise of Hallmark, Faro, and Spatz was interpreted not as a discouragement, but as an incitement. Japan's intent to instill caution in America backfired, yielding the reverse effect. Military strategists discussed escalation in terse tones, advocating for strikes characterized by overwhelming power rather than bold, symbolic actions. Upon receiving the briefing, Roosevelt set his jaw, declaring simply, "Their sacrifice will not be in vain." Eventually, these words would be embodied by bomb bays massive enough to obscure the heavens. Japanese authorities framed the executions as a just act, proudly asserting that even a powerful America must submit to their legal system. Yet, under the veneer, uncertainties persisted. Certain officers wondered about the prudence of executing captives, pondering if it risked provoking an immeasurable retaliation. Within Tokyo's governmental spheres, such misgivings were suppressed by official narratives, but time would validate their foresight. The empire had reacted with fury, inadvertently trapping itself in an inescapable predicament. The emaciated and traumatized surviving raiders were finally freed in 1945 as American forces swept across the Pacific. Contemporary photographs depicted men barely identifiable, with hollow eyes and withered, yet living bodies. Their later accounts would expose the savage nature of their imprisonment, the injustice of their sham trial, and the terror of the executions. They came home to a country that lauded them as champions, but the specters of their incarceration remained with them. Du Chaser would devote his existence to advocating for forgiveness, even journeying to Japan to share his message of compassion, while his comrades bore more subdued scars into old age. Their experiences integrated into a broader tale, demonstrating the human toll of conflict and how malevolence can alter fates. However, in 1942, these events had not yet unfolded. What became undeniable in the quiet aftermath of the Shanghai executions was Japan's transgression of an irreversible boundary. 3 men lay interred in meager graves. Another's life ebbed away in confinement, and 4 more suffered immeasurably. The Doolittle raid, initially a symbolic act of defiance across the sea, had now transformed into something more sinister, a blood obligation forever imprinted on collective memory. Such debts, once inscribed in blood, are never dismissed. America would exact repayment not with 3 planes, nor with 16, but with an impending fleet of destructive power. American factories operated ceaselessly. Throughout the night, welding torches cast cascades of sparks. Machinery bellowed like confined animals, and production lines advanced with an unyielding, rhythmic cadence. The colossal industrial capacity of the United States had transformed into a unified war machine, continuously producing steel, fuel, aircraft components, and engines, until the very atmosphere vibrated with latent power. The demise of 3 Doolittle raiders was etched into the national consciousness as if sacred, and although no official declaration of retribution was made, each rivet fastened into aluminum, every B-29 exiting an assembly line, bore the burden of their sacrifice. The conflict would no longer be met with mere gestures. It would be met with conflagration. The B-29 Superfortress was an unprecedented aircraft globally. This colossal, shining bomber boasted a wingspan exceeding a city block and could transport its payload across vast oceans. Its initial handlers perceived it as both elegant and formidable, a device offering salvation to some, while ensuring destruction for others. It possessed the capability to ascend beyond Japanese fighter planes, outpace Pacific winds, and deliver bomb loads far greater than those of the audacious B-25s from the Doolittle raid. Its mere presence demonstrated America's shift from symbolic actions to in pursuit of overwhelming supremacy. General Curtis LeMay, a stout, forthright man with a cigar often clenched in his mouth, became the mastermind behind this aerial campaign. He had scant tolerance for indecision or emotion. His troops nicknamed him Iron Ass due to his exacting nature, yet beneath his tough facade was a shrewd intellect that viewed combat as a precise art of devastation. During the initial 1944 bombings, LeMay directed his B-29s to conduct high-altitude precision strikes against Japanese factories and shipyards. However, outcomes proved unsatisfactory. Jet streams disrupted flight patterns, bombs landed in rice fields instead of industrial sites, and dense fog frequently obscured objectives. U.S. casualties increased, leading detractors to suggest that even the superfortress might fail to compel Japan's capitulation. LeMay conceived a solution that was both revolutionary and ruthless. He commanded the bombers be divested of most armaments and lightened for increased bomb capacity, then dispatched at low altitude below the jet stream during nighttime. Their new payload consisted not of conventional explosives, but incendiary clusters intended to set ablaze wooden urban areas like tinder. The reasoning was unforgiving. Japan's military production relied as much on its urban districts, where components were handmade, as on its major factories. Eradicate the cities. Dismantle the war apparatus. The strategy commenced on March 9, 1945, when over 300 B-29s thundered above Tokyo, unleashing torrents of flame from their bomb bays. The metropolis transformed into a blazing hellscape. Wind-driven flames coalesced into firestorms, devouring all in their wake. Pavement melted, waterways simmered, and the very atmosphere turned lethal. That night alone saw the incineration of almost 100,000 people. Men, women, and children. Those who endured recounted avenues flowing with liquid metal, corpses heaped along canals, and a sky crimson as a chasm of damnation. From above, The spectacle was simultaneously victorious and agonizing for the flight crews. A bombardier recorded that Tokyo's fiery brilliance was visible from 150 miles distant, resembling a sanguine dawn. Some celebrated, certain of having delivered a decisive strike. Others flew back in quiet contemplation, troubled by the realization that beneath their bombs lay not just combatants, but entire households. LeMay dismissed reservations with a soldier's practical mindset. Eliminate enough of them and resistance ceases. This cold, unyielding logic proved effective in the grim calculations of warfare. Tokyo's firebombing marked merely the onset. Successive nights saw B-29 swarm over Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and numerous smaller urban centers. By summer, over 60% of Japan's cities were reduced to rubble. Survivors navigated the debris, holding their children, their lungs scorched by tar-like smoke. Rice fields became temporary shelters, temples improvised medical facilities. A formerly proud empire, which had showcased the executions of captured Americans to assert its power, now witnessed whole cities disappear within hours. Japan's leadership publicly vowed continued resistance, though privately some began to acknowledge the impossibility of victory. Within this destruction, the specter of the executed airmen persisted. For their remaining comrades, each sortie felt like an unresolved task, as if the aircraft engines themselves echoed the names of Hallmark, Faro, Spatz, and Meter. Back home, families absorbed news of immense raids, and some, perhaps privately, believed their sons had been avenged. But retribution proved complex. Each firestorm intensified the dilemmas. What constituted sufficient destruction? At what point did justice mutate into something different? These queries, murmured in places of worship and military quarters, offered no simple solutions, as war seldom does. Nonetheless, the offensive intensified. By mid-1945, the scope was astonishing. Over 20,000 bombers had attacked Japan, delivering payloads equivalent not to tons, but to mountainous quantities of fire. Every mission deepened the contradiction. America, which started the war with a desperate symbolic act, now controlled the skies with an apparently limitless arsenal and unyielding determination. For Japanese civilians, the roar of engines above was more than auditory. It was a verdict, a stark reminder that the supposedly righteous war now inflicted terror upon their residences. Despite cities burning and thousands perishing nightly, the Japanese government held onto the belief of holding out. Certain leaders theorized that sufficient casualties inflicted on an invasion force might force American negotiations. Others entertained hopes of Soviet intervention. However, with every week, the skies darkened further with American aircraft, and the infernos intensified. The empire that sought to intimidate America by executing 3 airmen now confronted an abyss illuminated by the wings of 10,000 machines. American aircrews felt a blend of exhaustion and somber pride. Their letters described the bizarre splendor of cities illuminated below, with fires appearing as luminous streams. Some grimly quipped about transforming Japan into a colossal charcoal briquette. Humor served as a fragile defense against the immense scope of their actions. Yet such defenses could falter, and in the stillness following missions, many expressed disquiet. Could such widespread devastation truly equate to triumph? By July, Japan lay in ruins, but remained defiant. The assaults had ravaged its urban centers, crippled its industry, and displaced millions, yet its government resisted capitulation. American command confronted a dire dilemma. If 20,000 bombers hadn't ended the conflict, what would? The solution resided in the desert, concealed by secure barriers and cryptic designations. Despite all the infernos unleashed by the superfortresses, a different, more intense, brilliant, and ultimate form of fire was poised to descend. Hiroshima awoke to an August dawn, like any other warm, golden, and deceptively serene. Children headed to school, books tucked beneath their arms. Women queued for water, and laborers pedaled to partially functioning factories amidst scarcities. Above, the sky was impeccably azure, appearing as if rendered by an artist oblivious to conflict. Unseen, a B-29 orbited high above, a lone silver speck in the expansive firmament, carrying not conventional fire or steel bombs, but an utterly novel device. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the global landscape was irreversibly altered. A sun-rivaling flash erupted over the city. Imprints of shadows were scorched onto surfaces. Human tissue vaporized into ash. The ensuing shockwaves surged outwards, demolishing structures, flinging bodies, and sparking a firestorm so intense it caused rivers to boil and rendered the atmosphere deadly. Tens of thousands of lives ceased in an instant, and Hiroshima became a name uttered with a mix of reverence and terror. 3 days subsequently, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. Another sky, another flash, another metropolis annihilated. By this point, Tokyo's leadership could no longer dispute the unavoidable. Japan, already devastated by continuous firebombing, now confronted an unimaginable weapon. The emperor, though divinely mandated yet spiritually exhausted, broadcast a surrender address, referring to a new and most cruel bomb and the necessity of bearing the unbearable. For the initial time in its annals, Japan yielded. To achieve victory, the conflict, having been ignited by the unexpected strike on Pearl Harbor and then met with audacious defiance above Tokyo, drew to a close amid the profound quiet of vanished metropolises. Yet, beneath the widespread declarations of surrender, less public narratives unfolded. These tales trace their origins to a spring day in 1942, when a mere 16 bombers valiantly lifted off from the deck of the USS Hornet. The remaining members of the Doolittle group, exhibiting the deep toll of prolonged captivity with their gaunt figures and sunken eyes, were eventually released from Japanese internment facilities. Jacob de Chazer, though physically broken, stepped into the sun with an invigorated spirit, having undergone a profound internal change. Chase Nielsen, a man of quiet dignity, bore lasting scars that would never completely vanish, yet he had embraced a faith that transformed his bitterness into a capacity for forgiveness. Their fellow airmen who had perished, Hallmark, Faro, Spatz, and Meter, never came back, yet their enduring memory was carried aloft by every subsequent bomber journeying across the Pacific. In one perspective, their executions had effectively ignited a chain reaction, its ultimate and blinding culmination realized in Hiroshima. For the American airmen who had executed the widespread bombing operations of 1945, the taste of triumph was akin to ashes. Their correspondence home conveyed pride, yet also a profound sense of disquiet. One pilot described the inferno of Nagoya as peering into the gateway of hell itself, left agape. Another confessed his inability to offer prayers without visualizing the faces of children fleeing through fire. While not academic thinkers, an instinctual awareness suggested to them that warfare had traversed a critical boundary, one from which human civilization might not recover. The B-29, the superfortress, emerged not merely as a symbol of conquest, but also as an emblem of profound moral introspection. Meanwhile, in Japan, those who had lived through the devastation stumbled amidst the debris and oppressive quiet. A young girl named Sadako roamed through the wreckage, desperately searching for her parents, her tiny fingers clutching the scorched fabric of a school uniform. An elderly man sat next to the burnt shell of his dwelling, swaying gently, his soft whispers of names now met only with silence. Priests tolled broken temple bells across the desolate ash-laden landscapes, their chimes softened by the lingering smoke. These poignant scenes, conveyed via written accounts and later permanently recorded in photographs, compelled the global populace to acknowledge the exorbitant price exacted by unbridled retribution. Japan's aim had been to strike fear into America by executing imprisoned aviators. America countered by revealing the ultimate meaning of terror, delivered from above. The grim irony was both acute and unforgiving. The 4 aviators, once labeled war criminals for deploying a limited number of bombs over Tokyo, were by then deceased. Yet, their own nation had subsequently deployed countless bombs, culminating in a pair of devices unlike any previously witnessed. The true accounting of history was recorded not through legal discourse, but in a tally of human lives lost and cities obliterated. Nonetheless, from within that devastation, an unforeseen sentiment began to take root. Those who endured Hiroshima and Nagasaki voiced not merely their anguish, but also their ardent plea for peace, urging that no urban center ever again suffer such an inferno. Across America, certain airmen who had once made grim jokes about barbecued cities started to advocate against atomic warfare. Even Curtis LeMay, often seen as the primary architect of destruction, conceded years later that had the United States been defeated, he could well have faced charges as a war criminal. The boundary separating justice from vengeance, perpetually indistinct, dissolved almost entirely in the blinding flash of atomic detonation. Yet, amidst this ethical ambiguity, a singular truth shone forth. Minor acts of inhumanity possess the power to unleash repercussions far grander than conceived. The 1942 execution of 3 pilots was meant as a stern caution, an assertion of Japanese might and determination. Instead, it inadvertently sowed the seeds of an inferno that ultimately engulfed their own urban centers. A symbolic attack by just 16 aircraft ballooned into an aerial assault involving some 20,000 bombers. And an initial deployment of a few bombs eventually concluded with 2 cataclysmic detonations that fundamentally reshaped the modern global order. The profound implication of these events was clear to those who lived through them, though individual interpretations varied widely. For some, it offered justification. For others, a dire warning. And for still others, a tragedy of incalculable magnitude. In the decades that followed, the Doolittle Raiders convened for annual reunions, lifting silver goblets inscribed with their names to honor departed comrades. With each passing year, fewer glasses were raised, and more were left inverted, a solemn gesture of remembrance. Their saga, initially classified and then heralded as a propaganda coup, had transcended into legend. They lived to witness their audacious mission recalled not solely as an emblem of steadfast defiance, but also as the initial spark igniting the most catastrophic aerial conflict known to history. Some held pride in this legacy, others felt sorrow, but all recognized that their destinies were inextricably intertwined with the flames of history. Thus, the concluding chapter of the war unfolded, not with triumphant celebration, but with a profound silence. This was the silence of annihilated urban landscapes, of captives released posthumously, of somber bells tolling above vast expanses of ash. It was the resonant quiet that descends after a mighty thunderclap, where ears continue to ring and spirits remain unsettled. To the global community, that silence posed a formidable question. If the desire for retribution could escalate from 3 executions to the deployment of 20,000 bombers, what future horrors might be unleashed by the armaments that obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki? This was a query destined to reverberate through countless generations, softly uttered each time aerial shadows swept across the sky.